Hello and welcome back to chapter 13. I think this will be the fourth and final instalment, and then you'll be there with this the chapter on economics. So we're as far as section 8 so far, aren't we? And we're going to talk about types of market structure. And what this is all about is the number of buyers and sellers that we have in a market. Okay, and what we're going to do is go from one extreme to another. So with one type of market structure, there are going to be loads and loads of buyers and sellers. Okay, whereas in other types of market structure, there might only be one seller, or indeed one buyer. So let's make a start. Perfect competition, first of all. I mean, this is the sort of free market ideal. Okay, and again, it's a sort of theoretical concept. I don't think we have any real world examples of perfect competition. We might get pretty close to it in certain markets, okay, but it's a theoretical extreme where what we have is many small buyers and sellers, okay, and because there's so many of them, none of them have any power, so none of them can influence market price. We are what's referred to as price takers, so we just accept the market price and we can't do anything to influence it. There are no barriers to either entry or exit, so businesses can join or leave. So if they spot an opportunity to make profit, they will join. Okay, if they're not making a profit, then they can easily leave. Everyone has perfect information. So all your consumers, all your producers know exactly what prices are being charged everywhere. So there's no opportunity to pull a fast one, for instance. All the goods are identical. They're homogeneous, so identical products. And these buyers and sellers, they don't work together. Yeah, they don't form groups. There's no collusion. Okay, so they don't have any power within the market. Now the consequences of perfect competition, well, as I've said, suppliers are price takers. Okay, they can sell as much as they want, but only at the market price. So they would be facing a horizontal, perfectly elastic demand curve. They can sell as much as they want at that price. If they put their prices up at all, then nobody would buy their products. Their demand would disappear, and there's no point dropping the prices there because they can sell as much as they want at this price. So a horizontal demand curve. Now, in the long run at least, firms only earn what's known as a normal profit, so just basically the bare minimum to keep them in this industry. If they earned any more than that, other firms would spot the opportunity, join the industry, and split the profits between one more firm. Yeah, so the market automatically reduces everyone's profit down to this bare minimum level called normal profits. And everyone sells at a single price. Now, as I said, I mean, it rarely happens. I mean, you could argue the stock exchange, for instance, is fairly close to this, but not really. The commodities exchange, I've heard people say, are a decent example of perfect competition, but we never quite get there because there's always some sort of barrier to entry. People don't have perfect information. Yeah, some people have more information than others, so there's always some sort of asymmetry there. Goods are not homogeneous. Yeah, you can differentiate your goods, and quite often either buyers or indeed sellers work together and collude in some way. But it's there as a sort of theoretical concept. Now, the opposite of many sellers is one seller. Okay, and that's a monopoly. Yeah, one supplier. There could still be many buyers, but the reason the industry only has one supplier is usually because there are very high barriers to entry, which could take a number of forms, couldn't they? As you can see, there could be huge setup costs. Yeah, well, that will keep out new entrants. Maybe you've developed a new product and you've got patent protection on that product, so nobody else can get a piece of the action. Maybe you've got access to unique resources. So you've got the right to drill North Sea oil or something like that, and nobody else has. Or maybe you've got a unique talent. Nobody else can replicate what it is you're doing. It could be that it's a monopoly which is formed by the state. Yeah, so something which is so important to the nation that the state wants to take control of it. Okay, and there used to be a lot of examples of state-run monopolies. British Telecom, British Gas, British Steel. Okay, gradually sort of dwindled away. And there's also finally this concept of size domination. Okay, that if you have a firm within an industry that is very, very large in comparison to the market, there just isn't room for anyone else to get in there. Yeah? They are dominating the market all by themselves. Now, the outcome of a monopoly tends to be that a monopoly will raise the price of its products compared with what would result from perfect competition, let's say, and they'd also tend to restrict the quantity supplied. Now, by increasing the price and restricting quantity, they can earn supernormal profits. Okay, so more than the level that's required to keep them there. Okay, other firms would love a piece of the action. Yeah, they'd love to get in there, but they can't because of these barriers to entry. Now, different types of monopoly. A pure monopoly, well, this again is a sort of, well, almost a sort of theoretical extreme where there literally is just one supplier. More sort of real world stuff, an actual monopoly, is where you've got a supplier with a dominant market share. So there are other firms actually in the market, but you've got one dominant player. So we would tend to still refer to that as a monopoly. So sometimes governments create monopolies, and a natural monopoly is where you're in an industry which has such a high level of fixed costs that it can really only support one firm. There's only one firm can afford to bear those costs, and once they've borne those costs, nobody else can get in because it would just be so expensive. So, for instance, public utilities. Okay, once you've spent all that money on constructing the infrastructure, I don't know, think about all the sort of water pipes or electricity cables or whatever it is. Okay, nobody else can replicate that sort of infrastructure. So it keeps everyone else out, and it's a natural monopoly. Now, quite commonly, we see monopolies as acting against consumers' interests, by deliberately increasing the price and restricting supply, okay, and therefore monopolies often need to be regulated. Okay, and that's certainly what's happened in this country, isn't it? With a lot of these old state-owned, nationalised industries following privatisation, at the same time there was a regulator put in place, just to make sure that monopoly wasn't abusing its position of power. Now, something that sounds like a monopoly, but is actually very different, is monopolistic competition. Okay, lots of buyers and sellers again with this. The difference between this and perfect competition, though, is the products are different. There is product differentiation, there is branding, okay, and therefore there is a degree of customer loyalty. There's no customer loyalty in perfect competition because everyone has identical products. There could be barriers to entry, but they're not insurmountable. And what tends to happen with monopolistic competition is there's lots of advertising. Lots of advertising sort of stressing the qualities of your product, trying to get this customer loyalty. So examples could be pubs and hairdressers. Loads and loads and loads of them, aren't they? But they're not quite the same. Now, what are the consequences of monopolistic competition? Well, you can put your prices up if you like, but that will cause a loss of not all of your customers, but some of them will certainly move elsewhere. They'll stop eating in your pub and they'll eat in the other pub half a mile down the road. Okay, and therefore the idea is in the long run, you only earn normal profits. Couple more. Oligopoly, a few large sellers. But again, lots of buyers. Okay, supermarkets would be a great example in this country of oligopolies, where I think the top 4 supermarkets have got over a 70% share of the market. You've got Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, and Morrison's as the top 4. There is differentiation and mutual interdependency. Yeah, they're always sort of keeping track of what the other ones are doing. Yeah, and where one of them undertakes a particular course of action, the others tend to follow suit. So, one of them launches online selling, the rest launch online selling. One of them drops the price of their petrol by 2p a litre, what do you know? The rest then follow suit. So lots of interdependency. Consequences, well, there's lots of non-price competition, lots of advertising. Think about the sort of loyalty reward cards, that sort of thing that the supermarkets go for. Price cuts are generally copied and may lead to price wars, but price increases not always copied. And again, that's the issue of the kinked demand curve. Remember we talked about that in the elasticity part of the chapter. Depending on whether you're putting prices up or down, okay, you can have a different response. A duopoly is the final market structure we need to look at, and this is just 2 suppliers. Again, tends to result in higher prices because there's very limited competition. Okay, and in fact, there's a temptation for these 2 suppliers to collude, okay, which is often illegal. Collusion. That's called creating a cartel. Okay, but without any regulation, there would be an incentive there to do that. Now, everything we've talked about so far concentrated on sellers, didn't it? The number of sellers in a market. Probably just worth me mentioning the term monopsony. Okay, which sounds a bit like monopoly again, doesn't it? And a monopsony is where you're in the situation where there is only one buyer as opposed to one seller. Okay, so just in case you see that in questions. Now, there's this idea that perfect competition is the best market structure. Yeah, it gives you the best outcome for your consumers, and that's why it's called perfect competition, I guess. But what's so good about it? Well, why is perfect competition seen as the best structure? Well, here are the arguments. It's argued that free markets are efficient. They allocate resources in the best possible way. They're impersonal. Yeah, there's no sort of bias or prejudice in there. Yeah, they're completely objective. And as far as efficiency is concerned, it's argued that a perfectly competitive market is allocatively efficient and productively efficient. Now, allocative efficiency is where resources are allocated in such a way that you couldn't change it and increase the overall benefit in the economy. It's the best possible allocation of your scarce resources. Productive efficiency is where firms are producing at the lowest possible cost. They're efficient in production. Now, that's all great, isn't it? However, free markets don't always achieve this. Markets sometimes fail. So that's what we're going to look at now, market failure. A situation in which a free market fails to produce an efficient allocation of resources. I'm going to look at 4 instances of market failure. So let's get straight into the first one, market imperfections. Now, we've seen perfect competition just doesn't happen. Okay, you can end up with monopoly elements. restricting supply and keeping prices high. Well, that is not allocatively efficient. Okay. Also, there's an argument that monopolies are not productively efficient either. They've got no incentive to produce things at the lowest possible cost because there's no competition there giving them that incentive to keep their costs down. So a monopoly would be an example of a market failure. A monopsony, which I've just defined for you, large buyers. Okay, and again, they can distort the market, exerting too much control over their suppliers. Now, in theory, a monopsony is one buyer. Okay, in practice, it's very difficult to think of an example of that. But again, think about the supermarkets where you have a few very large buyers, and they're often criticised, aren't they, for exerting too much pressure, exerting too much power over their suppliers, so demanding ridiculously low prices, really long credit terms. The other reason the free market doesn't always allocate resources properly is that we don't have perfect information, do we? We don't know that the price we've just paid, we could have got exactly the same product just down the road a lot cheaper. Now this has become less of a problem, I think, hasn't it, with the introduction of the internet, where it's very, very easy to go onto price comparison websites and so on, but it still isn't perfect information. Yeah, and therefore, unbeknownst to us, we are making an inefficient choice. Now, second example of market failure is this concept of externalities. Okay, and an externality is the difference between private and social costs, or private and social benefits, which arise from an exchange in the market. So, what do we mean by that? Well, private cost is the cost to the supplier of the resources that it uses. Private benefit is the benefit obtained by a supplier or by a customer. And that's really all we've been thinking about so far, isn't it? But in any given exchange, there may be a cost to society as a whole, and that's what we call the social cost. Now, the supplier and buyer don't take that into account. They only take their private costs into account. Equally, with some exchanges, there's a social benefit. There's a benefit to society as a whole. But again, we might not take that into account. So, examples of social costs are things like pollution, environmental damage. Okay, and maybe we don't take those into account when we make our buying decisions, or firms don't take them into account when they make their decisions on supply. Equally, social benefits. Society as a whole benefits from education. Society as a whole benefits from a healthcare system that stops the spread of contagious diseases, for instance. Now, the idea with this market failure is where a particular transaction has social costs, there's a tendency for us to overconsume those things, to oversupply those things because we're not taking those costs into account. So potentially the government would need to step in to restrict it, to penalise us for causing environmental damage, for instance. Equally, with these things here, there might be a tendency for us to underconsume education or underconsume healthcare. So in that case, the government might need to step in and maybe make it compulsory. Compulsory schooling until the age of 16. Compulsory checkups, I don't know, for children, for instance, to make sure we derive the social benefits that are possible from that particular market exchange. So have a quick look at this interactive question. Much Wapping is a small town where a municipal swimming pool and sports centre have just been built by a private company. Which of the following is an external benefit of the project? Increased trade for local shops, increased traffic in the neighbourhood, the increased profits for the private company, and the increased building on previously open land in an inner city area? Well, I guess there the external benefit is A, isn't it? Yeah, it's the increased trade for the local shops. They are external to this transaction, but they are benefiting from it. So just be aware of this concept of externalities. So external to the two immediate parties to the transaction, there can be additional costs or additional benefits. Nine 9.5, another market failure, and this one's called public goods. Now, a public good has two key characteristics. What we've called here non-excludability and non-diminishability. Non-excludability means it's very difficult or impossible to exclude people from getting the benefit of this particular good. Once you've provided it, you provide it for everyone. Yeah, and it's very difficult to keep people out. Non-diminishability means as more and more people use this thing, it doesn't get used up. Yeah, there's still plenty to go around for everyone else. Okay, now, examples of public goods are these things down here. Yeah, national defense. Yeah, your army, air force, navy. Once you've got that in place, it's impossible to exclude anyone, isn't it? Yeah, everyone in the country is protected by those guys. And equally, if a few more people are born, or the death rate drops, so the population increases, we don't use up national defence, do we? There's still plenty to go around. Same thing with policing, and on a smaller scale, lighthouses. How would you exclude someone from getting the benefit of a lighthouse? Yeah, and on a very small scale, street lighting. Now, the problem we've got with public goods is that they tend to give rise to this thing called a free rider problem. That if you left this to the market, nobody would buy it. Because everyone knows that as soon as it's there, they can just take advantage of it anyway, and there's nothing you can do to keep them out. Now, the problem in the market then is if nobody buys it, nobody's going to produce it either, yeah, because there's no profit there. So the result is that usually production ends up being organised by the government. Yeah, and that's certainly the case, isn't it, with these examples. So public good, non-excludability, non-diminishability. Yeah, the market fails to provide these things, so the government has to step in. Now what we've got finally in section 9.6 is these things called economies of scale, which in themselves are not market failures. In themselves, this can be great. Large companies being able to save money for various reasons, but it becomes a market failure where we don't pass these savings on to buyers. Yeah, which again could happen, for instance, with a monopoly. Now, where do economies of scale come from? Well, there's two types: internal and external. So some economies which are internal to the business and some which are external. Have a look through this list. As a business grows, takes on more and more and more staff, it's possible, using division of labour, for them to all perform much, much, much more specialist jobs. Therefore, productivity increases and you save money. Same thing with your machinery. Yeah, the bigger your business, the more specialised the machinery is, and therefore the more productive it can be. We can have what are called dimensional economies of scale. And this refers to the fact that the bigger your operations are, the smaller your unit costs get. Okay, so for instance, imagine the cost of transporting, oil across the Atlantic in a huge tanker. Okay, the cost per litre of oil is much, much, much smaller than the cost of you just taking a couple of barrels over on the back of your boat. Yeah, so the bigger the scale you're operating under, the lower your average costs get. And buying economies, you can command much, much better discounts from your suppliers the larger you get. Yeah, you can demand better interest rates from the banks because you're a much larger organisation. Indivisibility of operations is it's a little bit like the dimensional economies actually, and this means that until you get to a certain size, it just isn't worth buying certain things. So for instance, I don't know, a really expensive TV advertising campaign, okay, you simply can't consider doing that unless you are a large business with a huge marketing budget. Yeah, small businesses have to find alternatives. Yeah, so your advertising cost per unit sold could well be a lot smaller. And holding inventory, the larger your organization is, the much easier they'll find it to have efficient inventory controls, which again increases their efficiency and reduces their average costs. External economies of scale, in contrast, refer to the benefits that you get as your industry grows. Okay, and this typically happens within a geographical area. So for instance, the Midlands specialised in manufacturing cars, and therefore there were various economies of scale external to the business themselves, such as a large local skilled labour force. Yeah, many people in those local communities were very skilled working in the car industry. So therefore all these firms had access to that. It could be an infrastructure grows up, the transport infrastructure, the roads grow up around that particular business. And all your suppliers, all the ancillary industries position themselves around you, which means all the supplies that you need are very close, reduces your delivery costs, reduces your lead times. Now the final comment here just says the extent of the available economies of scale varies from one industry to another. Okay. If you have an industry which offers very large economies of scale, then those are the industries which tend to find themselves with very large firms. And therefore those are the industries that tend to find themselves in this sort of monopoly or oligopoly type situation. If an industry doesn't have many economies of scale, okay, then what you tend to find is you end up with lots and lots of firms in that particular sector. Yeah, so the availability of these economies of scale can influence the type of market structure that we end up with. Okay, and that's it. That's the end of chapter 13. So very well done. I know that was a bit of a slog, wasn't it, to get through economics? So 4 separate lectures there, but it's useful stuff. It's a reasonable proportion of your syllabus, so you can expect to see some questions on that. So what I would do is go back through your notes now, make sure you understand what we've been talking about, and then hit the questions. So have a look at your question bank and see how you go with those questions. As always, give us a call if you've got any problems, and we'll see you in the next chapter.